And this summer I'm doing research with Dr. Lewis on these little things called bacteriophages and how well they can infect bacteria. They look like this, they're tiny. Well, I'm a biology major. This is my senior year, so my last year, and I'm really glad I got to do this opportunity, and I really wanted to thank all the donors who make this possible and gave me this opportunity.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to IDIS 300, Life After COVID. And thank you all for hanging with us for 5 weeks. It's been a great course. I'm really happy to welcome you again this evening for our last talk of the course. This evening, it's our very own Anand Rao. Anand has been working with me on this course all summer and helped a lot with COVID-19 in context last summer as well. It's been great working with him. He's the consummate professional. He's an excellent speaker too. So I'm really looking forward to Dr. Anand Rao's presentation this evening on COVID and how it's affected communication. Before we get there, just a reminder that the chat box is for you to communicate with the host and let us know if you have any technical issues. The Q&A box is available for you to ask questions to the speaker. So go ahead and enter your questions in there and go ahead and upvote the ones that you like. And we'll make sure that the questions that get the largest number of upvotes get asked first once we get to the Q&A, which is at around 4:30. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker here. But before I do so, I want to take a moment to also thank everybody who has given a donation over the course of this class. It has really helped us tremendously to build our endowment for student research and learning, the Beyond the Classroom endowment. And understand also that those gifts that you've given have all been matched by one of our donors as well. And so I want to share with you quickly before we get to Professor Rao, a short video message from Kathy Wotecki.
I'm Kathy Wotecki, a proud member of the Mary Washington class of 1969. It's been more than 50 years since I studied biology and chemistry on this beautiful campus. And I'm happy to know that Mary Washington is continuing its strong tradition of undergraduate research. The Summer Science Institute happening now is one such opportunity. For 10 weeks, some of the university's top science students are working alongside faculty in the lab, conducting original research and ultimately presenting their findings. This is exactly the kind of experience that led me on the path to an enriching career in science, in higher education, and in the federal government.
We created the Beyond the Classroom Endowment to support high-impact learning experiences like this, including not only research, but also study abroad, internships, and individual study opportunities. We are grateful to donors like Kathy and Tom for supporting this work and ensuring that all UMW students have the opportunity to pursue learning beyond the classroom.
Tom and I are thrilled to see so much support for the Beyond the Classroom Endowment. I wanted to remind you, though, that we're matching all gifts to the endowment dollar for dollar through the end of July. So I hope that you'll consider joining us in creating unique learning opportunities for UMW students.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to Keith for that nice introduction, and thank you to Kathy and Tom Witecki for their generous support. It's really wonderful to see that kind of support from our alums and members of the UMW community. I'm excited to be here with you today, and there are a lot of thoughts that I've had about how COVID has impacted society and in particular communication practices just over the last year, and there's a lot that has come to mind. I'm reminded though about an experience I had years ago. I've recorded interviews with my grandparents about some of their life experiences. They both grew up on farms in the Midwest and told many stories about growing up during the Great Depression. What stood out to me was the impact that that experience had on them for the rest of their lives. Virtually every life decision was viewed through that experience of living through the Depression. And I've thought about that a lot over the last 16 months. I wonder how much of the rest of our lives will be influenced by our pandemic experience. COVID has certainly had a big impact on how we communicate. And I think we're going to see the lingering effects of the pandemic on our communication practices for years to come. Now, over the past 5 weeks, we've heard from UMW faculty about the impact of COVID on business, higher education, language rights, inequality in the workplace, poverty, federal action, how COVID compares to other historical pandemics and diseases, and the current science of COVID. It's been a really remarkable set of presentations, and kudos to my colleagues for their excellent work. I've learned a lot and really enjoyed these sessions. There's still a lot to unpack and reflect upon, but I've taken a few key themes that have been referenced or discussed throughout most of the presentations, and I wanted to start with that. The first is that in most areas, the pandemic was an accelerant and not a change agent. There's little that is brand new in our society as a result of COVID, but the pandemic certainly accelerated trends that were already underway by early 2020. Secondly, the idea that American society is more polarized and splintered than ever. Again, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's certainly gotten worse over the last year. Third, in some ways, a response to societal polarization, we've experienced a politicization of science on a new level. It's a tough one to get our heads around. We've had a lot of discussion about this. To question science when we're facing a crisis that only science can address just doesn't seem to make sense, but that's exactly what's happening. And the fourth item is that of getting through the pandemic and returning to normal. There's not really a return to normal. We will get through this, but what we're going to have to do is get used to a new normal. In some areas, that's going to be a big plus. We've developed new practices and techniques for how we work, go to school, interact. In other areas, this new normal could be one of greater inequality, and that's a real concern. We need to be mindful of what new normal will be and how much we can determine its course. Now, these themes really resonated for me in preparing this talk, and I've thought a lot about them over the past year. I think they're essential in understanding how COVID has impacted how we communicate and what's next for communication and life after COVID. So for today's talk, I plan on talking really about three areas. First, how we communicated during the pandemic. Secondly, digital communication and its effect on polarization. And third, how we might shape the new normal for digital communication. So let me start with a few observations about how we communicated during the pandemic and how that communication impacted our relationships. Now, by the middle of March 2020, the World Health Organization declared that COVID-19 was a pandemic. We entered a lockdown. We learned a new vocabulary with new terms like R0, flatten the curve, herd immunity, social distance, and we had to change how we communicated. As this comic demonstrates, it's not that easy to understand one another when we're wearing masks. But in spite of masks and COVID restrictions, of course, love finds a way. And certainly, I think this is the best baby onesie of the entire pandemic and says a lot about how we persevere. Now, while the Beatles opined that all you need is love, the truth is you also need communication. Effective communication is central. It's really key to healthy relationships of all sorts, whether it's with your partner, family, coworkers, or friends. The pandemic disrupted those relationships in a number of important ways, largely because of how our communication practices were disrupted. So I want to start with what happened as soon as we went into lockdown. Now, it's important to recognize that not all were in safe spaces during lockdown. There's little that communication alone can do for someone in an abusive situation or relationship. And that's an important consideration. But for many other relationships and families, this was a bit of a bright spot, the ability to be at home with loved ones during the lockdown. For Valentine's Day, Groupon put together a lockdown love report that included a pandemic relationship calculator. I found this really entertaining. They worked with a mathematician to very scientifically estimate how relationships aged during the pandemic. You can think of it in terms of relationship dog years. They estimated that the average relationship had aged 4 years between the start of the pandemic in March and by January 2021. Now, on the online calculator, you can enter the number of weeks you and your partner have worked from home together, how many hours per week you're together, as well as some other variables. Now, I used it earlier this week, and the calculator said that my relationship with my wife aged 7.7 years during COVID. And I think if you asked her, she'd say that sounds about right. Now, Groupon also conducted a survey of 2,000 American adults who were in a relationship and that were living together in January 21. And this is what they found were the effects of lockdown on those relationships. Close to 60% said that time stood still during the quarantine and that COVID has been the ultimate test of their relationship. Not a surprise to hear that. The average couple had not had a date in 5.5 months by January, yet they reported a number of very positive effects, including 73% saying the lockdown had strengthened their relationship. 65% reported they had learned more about each other, and almost half spent more quality time together. The lockdown gave many of us the opportunity to engage in the healthy communication that our relationships needed. And that was particularly important during a crisis. All of that togetherness did not come without some cost. About a quarter reported they were irritated with their partner for playing loud music or watching TV during work hours or spending too much time in the bathroom. 20% also found their partner had an annoying work phone voice that maybe they hadn't heard before. Now, my family didn't say that my Zoom voice was annoying, but they have complained quite a bit that I talk too loudly on Zoom calls. Now, the survey also found that 1/3 did something that we often did in our house. We took joint lunch breaks whenever we could. And I joked that our kitchen table was the break room. I also find it entertaining that as a result of the lockdown, 77% now know what their partner does for a living. I'm not sure what surprises me more about that statistic, that apparently some didn't know before lockdown, or that 23% still don't know what their partners do for a living. Fortunately, my family clearly knows what I do for a living because I'm so loud on all my Zoom calls. They could hear every minute of it. This article that I just found yesterday was published in Fast Company and highlights what many of us have experienced over the last 16 months. It's not all been a bed of roses and there have been conflicts, but the transition back to commuting to work can be challenging. And for many who were able to work from home during the pandemic, it's not going to be a return to the old normal. Many will still have some remote work options, and how that works will have to be negotiated between partners, between family members. The article talks about this new normal. We see the pendulum swinging back to something like what we experienced pre-COVID, but the longer term trends are likely to be somewhere in between. Now, aside from those that we lived with, or for those who were living alone, the lockdown isolated and separated us from others in a way that we probably never experienced before. Humans are social creatures. We're creatures of habit. So it makes sense that when we were first forced to socially distance, we all felt removed from one another. We were isolated, which felt unnatural for most because we crave social interactions and we're not used to being isolated, especially in that quick of a time frame. Now, business communication accommodated for this. It's one of the reasons why we were all inundated with emails of virtually every company we'd ever interacted with. There was an attempt to engage and maintain contact. While it may have gone a little bit far with some company emails, there was a good reason for it. Social isolation has a big impact on how we communicate and how we receive communication from others. A colleague in communication at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, Dr. Tim Levine, wrote about this past fall. He noted that there's important research on the effects of social isolation on communication. He wrote that, quote, "One impact is that the less contact we have with other people, the more we become suspicious of other people. This can make others more defensive and lead to a vicious spiral where isolation leads to suspicion, which begets defensiveness, which reinforces the suspicion and leads to further isolation as a self-fulfilling prophecy, end quote. Now, part of what Dr. Levine is referencing is how taking our communication practices and patterns out of their normal context can impact how we understand and engage with one another. And we need to consider this as it applies to a number of different communication practices and situations, a few of which I'm going to get into today. Now, the first one that references, something to reference briefly, but it's pretty important, and that's corporate or institutional communication. As I just noted, many companies email their customers in an attempt to stay engaged and to let them know how their business practices would change during the pandemic. There was a similar concern for internal communications in these organizations. Gallup has conducted a number of surveys on this post, asking about how well individuals in those organizations feel their leaders are communicating with the rest of the organization. In June 2020, this is just a couple, 3 months into the pandemic, Gallup found that about 35% of workers polled said their leaders had communicated a clear plan of action in response to COVID. This is just a third of workers, as leaders were trying to find a communication strategy that would work during a crisis. And that this requires a careful strategy and consistent action, prioritizing transparency and clearly stated communications. This is particularly important during a crisis, of course. Now, failure to do so can really shake the employees' confidence in their organization. And without the support of the employees, it's almost impossible for them to really weather that crisis. Now, an example that we probably could reference in the Q&A and maybe discuss a bit would be how UMW's COVID task force and implementation teams employed effective communication strategies over the last 16 months. And I would argue that they were really crucial to the university's success in maintaining a safe educational environment. I think we can also contrast this with some of the pitfalls of personal communication that we'll get to in a few minutes. Now, an extension of the first point is how we use digital communication tools during the pandemic, which I would argue helped contribute to further polarization. The pandemic did seem to reorder some of our priorities and needs as we adapted to the crisis. For many of us, this meant that we further relied on digital forms of communication. This is a prime example of how COVID was an accelerant for trends that were already underway. When US adults were asked how important the internet was to them personally during the pandemic in spring 2020, 87% said that it was either essential or important. And that measure of just how essential can be evidenced in how usage increased dramatically. This chart shows the average US household daily broadband usage. It was averaging about 12 or 13 gigabytes per day in January through March. And then immediately after lockdown, it jumped to over 17 gigabytes per day by April, an estimated 47% increase, something that we've never seen before in records of broadband usage. Now, much of the reason why the internet was so important to 87% of those surveyed and why household broadband increased so much was they needed it to communicate. Several research scholars published a study in September 2020 in the journal Social Media and Society. It was titled Changes in Digital Communication During the COVID-19 Global Pandemic, Implications for Digital Inequality and Future Research. And they commented on this and talked about what this might mean for future research. 1 month into the pandemic, American adults were surveyed about how their communication with friends and family not living in their household had changed since the start of the pandemic. That's a slide that's up right now, and this is from the article in September 2020. Here we can see 6 different means of digital communication highlighted. And you can see on the left, the darker colors shows text messages, voice calls, social media, voicemail, and so forth, and the number of people that use that more than they had before. And there are only a small percentage of people that use them less than they had pre-COVID. PC Magazine also noted where some of that data usage was deployed. And you can see here in gaming, certainly gaming platforms have found increased usage and certainly subscriptions, but also for business applications, including video conferencing, which is where I really want to focus my attention. There was explosive growth in this area. Microsoft Teams set a new record for total meeting minutes in a single day at 2.7 billion. That's in a single day. There were also 3,800 years worth of Google Meet sessions held in a single day. Slack saw an 80% increase in new paid customers, and Zoom saw, of course, we know about this growth, 2,900% growth of daily participants between December 2019 and March 2020. I had used Zoom before the pandemic, but maybe once every couple of weeks. And it seemed like it was every hour that I was logging into a new Zoom meeting after the pandemic went into effect. Now, we were also really creative in how we use these digital communication tools. As this survey from the Pew Research Center shows, as the percentage of US adults in each category had a virtual party online with family or friends, that's the column on the left, either watched a concert or play that was streamed online, that's the central column, and the percentage that participated in an online fitness class. That's a column on the right. So 32% of all US adults said that they had some kind of a social gathering or virtual party online. And you can see that 20% for concerts or play and 18% for an online fitness class. We were using these tools in ways that we had never used them before. Now, this last fall, business writer Diana Boer wrote an article titled How COVID-19 Has Changed Communication for the Better and for the Worst, highlighted some of the benefits and disadvantages that we saw through this extensive use of digital communication tools during the pandemic. And here are a few that she noted. The first one was that our communication was more intentional. She notes that when we're face-to-face in the office, it can be too easy to have quick conversations in the hallway that are very superficial. They really don't count as communication, and often we kind of pass the buck. But she notes that with a calendar request and a Zoom link, both parties know exactly what they're committing to, and that's an actual conversation, and they're not likely to reject it or evade it. Now, I think this was also true socially, personally. My family, my wife's family, we regularly logged into family Zoom calls with family members across the country and even around the world. Many of these people we hadn't seen for years, and we certainly didn't even talk to them that frequently. But during the pandemic, we were able to very intentionally reach out to them and find time to talk to them. And that was something that was really beneficial, and we've continued it. Now, she also noted that we had more efficient meetings. Many people on the meetings will keep their audio muted until they have something to contribute. And these online meetings can avoid repetitive, I agree comments or kudos. Now you just have to hit the applause reaction and move ahead. And it seemed to make some of those meetings a little bit more efficient. She also mentioned that it allowed for immediate follow-up. Zoom calls allow for participants to easily and quickly share links, documents, screens, like I'm sharing my screen right now, or links that we might put in the chat, or questions you have from the Q&A. It's not like having a conversation and then later waiting for that email attachment that was referenced in the earlier meeting. Now, for the worst, there are two that she noted that I'd like to note. The first was inattention while multitasking. I think we've all been guilty of this. We're sitting in a meeting, the discussion's focusing on someone else or a topic that we're not centrally concerned or interested in. So we might take that time to respond to an email, work on a document, check our social media feeds. Of course, this happens face-to-face as well, but it's more likely and easier to do when we're meeting online. No one can see your screen. And because of how our interactions are mediated through the screen, we don't feel the same obligation to stay focused. It can be a real problem in meetings. The second one is hiding. And this is turning off someone's camera. In many Zoom calls, it's become acceptable to keep your camera off, and there are often good reasons for doing this. And as an instructor, I would certainly prefer that my students keep their cameras on so I can see them. But if a student did not have stable Wi-Fi access, or if they were not comfortable showing their surroundings, I understand their need to keep their cameras off. Now, this is particularly true during a crisis and a lockdown, when many of them were not able to control important variables related to calling in. But Boer in her article is correct in noting this can be a real problem. In many ways, it's unparalleled in face-to-face communication. She noted, quote, "Can you imagine attending an in-person meeting where you realize some people are hiding under the conference table and you hear them occasionally join the discussion? It's never happened," end quote. And that's certainly somewhat of what it feels like in a Zoom call, where somebody stays completely black screened and their camera off and their microphone off, and then they join in for a moment and then they disappear again. Now, I've noticed an increase in the number of people keeping their cameras off, especially lately. I think there are two more recent and specific reasons for this increase. The first, of course, is Zoom fatigue. This comic jokes that Zoom calls can be a form of torture, as the man on the table reacts to his torturer holding up a Zoom call on a tablet. And he says, "Another Zoom chat? You are a monster." Too much of a good thing could be a problem, and Zoom fatigue had to be expected since so many of us went from 0 to 100 in terms of Zoom use in a matter of days. We burned out a little bit. Now, the second reason is that we're no longer in lockdown. It was easier to coax cameras on when we were a captive audience. We were looking for interaction, had little else to do. But now we're getting more social interaction in person. We're often juggling life outside of our homes. We don't have the time or space for as many Zoom calls as we once did. But I think the more general explanation has to do with how we communicate through conferencing tools. In our field, we refer to this as computer-mediated communication, or CMC. And this area of research has studied what works and doesn't work when we communicate through digital platforms. And it helps to start with a basic understanding of interpersonal communication. This is on the screens, a very common model of communication. You have two people communicating. Person on the left has something to share. They encode their thoughts into language. They send that message out by speaking. The person on the right receives the message and decodes it to understand what they mean. Now, that process alone can break down, as we might not find the right words to express our thoughts, or the receiver doesn't have the same understanding of what those words might mean. Then we have what's referenced on the screen as noise. That could be literal noise, like a leaf blower outside or a noisy HVAC system. It could also be internal noise, like distractions. You might start thinking about how you're going to respond to somebody's statement before you really understand what they're saying, or wondering what you're going to have for dinner after this presentation. Now, even when face-to-face, our communication model can break down. But when it starts to break down, we can rely on nonverbal communication to help us understand the other person's intent. That's why researchers note that most of our communication is nonverbal. It includes a lot. It's not more than the words, it's the tone and volume of our spoken words. It includes facial expressions, eye contact, gestures, proximity, overall body language. We subconsciously factor all of this in when we decode someone's meaning. But what happens when we move online? Well, let's think about how that mediated communication works. Early computer-mediated communication was really studying text chats, just text on a screen. That got rid of all nonverbal communication. At least with video conferencing, we can hear someone else's voice, we can see their face, as long as their camera's on. Now, even if everything is working as intended, the mediation of our communication through the Zoom call, seeing the other person on a screen instead of right in front of us, is going to change and potentially degrade our messaging. Now, factor in poor signals or small Zoom windows, and now your messaging can be severely limited. When we communicate online, we also experience what's referenced as online disinhibition, or an absence of restraint. We don't feel as connected with others when we're viewing them through a Zoom call. There's some benefits to this, to online disinhibition. For those who are shy, they can benefit from interactions that are not as overly stimulating, or if they feel they cannot talk about some issues face-to-face, they can feel more comfortable sharing online. It's also true that it's a safe place for members of marginalized groups to share information, support one another. It can also help students be more interactive online than they are sometimes in class. There are negative consequences too, of course, including cyberbullying. Now, it's not limited to anonymous or non-visual interactions. There's research from the University of Oregon in 2015 that has found that as workplace computer-mediated communication has increased, there's been an increase in toxic disinhibition effect, including bullying and creating a hostile workplace environment. Now, I would argue that an important contributor to online disinhibition, and in particular toxic disinhibition, is in the ways that computer-mediated communication inhibits online empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. A 2019 article in Clinical Psychology studied empathy in computer-mediated interactions, and it noted that because online communication partly filters out nonverbal cues, these could be socio-emotional cues, there's more difficulty in establishing empathy online. Their study looked at online healthcare and clinical interventions. And these are situations in which a trained professional is trying to exhibit empathy. Now, earlier research found that there were fewer empathic interactions per online session than face-to-face, and clinicians posited that there was a potential decrease in the ability to express empathy in online interventions. Now, this 2019 article explained this is due to the relative richness of the medium, how well the medium is able to share those verbal and nonverbal cues. It can be really difficult because of the immediacy of a feedback, the synchronicity of communication, thinking about transmission quality, communication content. The study noted that it was about more than just the words, but also the clinician's tone and rhythm, as well as visually perceptible clues like facial expressions, eye contact, body gestures, posture. These are all important to empathic communication. I was particularly taken with this quote from the study. It said, quote, "Being empathic is not only a matter of feeling empathy. A necessary step toward empathic attunement is the communication of empathy, that is, conveying one's feeling of empathy to the target individual." This comes back to that simple model for communication. We need to not only communicate and transmit a message, we need to share nonverbal cues and to see and receive the verbal and nonverbal messages from the person we're communicating with. Think about what this means for online communication. In this study, they were working with clinicians who were trying to be empathic and found that it was challenging. Now, what does that mean for the rest of us? This can, at least in part, explain why computer-mediated communication results in disinhibition. We do not readily see each other and feel disinhibited because we feel separated. Now, over the last several weeks, we've often made mention of how polarized and splintered our society is. There does not seem to be the common ground that we used to have that allowed for civil discourse and debate about all issues. Now, one of the most confounding has been the politicization of science. We were polarized before the pandemic, but it has appeared to have gotten worse. We might blame social media and echo chambers, and there's certainly a concern, but they were around before the pandemic. There are a lot of contributing factors. I'd like to point to a few factors that I believe have been the accelerant for this trend during the pandemic. First is the impact that social isolation has on how we communicate. Dr. Tim Levine referenced research that shows that as we isolate, we become more suspicious of each other, as I mentioned before. As we entered lockdown and isolated, we contributed to our polarization by becoming more suspicious of one another and our intent. And just think about how that accelerates those trends that were already occurring. Secondly, as we increased our reliance on digital communication tools in very short order, very quickly, think about how fast that happened. We unintentionally eroded our ability to communicate effectively. We were missing the nonverbal cues, as well as some of the verbal content. That meant that we were further isolating ourselves from others. It also meant that we were likely to only communicate with those who we were already familiar with, perhaps limiting our exposure to other perspectives and viewpoints, which I think could also have a really deleterious effect. And third, as we increased our reliance on digital communication, we limited our empathic communication. This is a result of the second point and one of the contributing causes for the first point. If we do not find a way to understand and share the feelings of others, then we're not going to be able to come together and engage in civil discourse and debate. Now, our reaction to current polarization might be to go back to face-to-face communication. Why keep using digital tools if they're making the situation worse? Now, while we will start to come together more in person and we should communicate more face-to-face, it's unrealistic to think that we can or should just go back to the way that it was before. There are real benefits to our increased use of digital communication tools, providing greater access and flexibility to many, while also providing support for those who are more likely to flourish online. Now, there are real inequities here, but there's some hope that we can address them. In a recent interview, Stephen Downes, who's a senior research officer for digital technologies with the National Research Council of Canada, was interviewed, and he was asked about what we can expect by 2025 in this field. He noted that the pandemic helped to force improvements in communication technologies for many who were left behind before, so it shows some improvement. And he also noted that with some effort, we can support, quote, discourse that is more cooperative and creative, that enables constructive response to be adopted society-wide to pressing issues of the day. With common communications protocols, solutions to pressing issues will begin to emerge. Now, I do believe that we have the opportunity to shape this new normal and create those common protocols. And I think here are some quick ideas for how we can do that. First of all, we need to work on empathetic communication online. The 2019 article I referenced earlier includes some strategies for how to do so. Now, it might be challenging for healthcare professionals to exhibit empathetic communication with their patients, but online sessions have provided greater access and support for many who would have otherwise not had gotten the help that they really needed. We can learn to adapt. After all, online communication may not inherently be worse than face-to-face, just that we've spent all of our lives learning how to adapt to face-to-face communication. Now we need to learn how to communicate effectively online, including how we incorporate nonverbal cues through video conferencing. Now, there's another area where I think we can work to improve online communication and shape the new normal, particularly as it relates to the key themes that I started with. And this gets to the idea of splintering and especially with the politicization of science. This is how we manage credibility online. Two communication scholars published an article in November 2020 on this topic. They offer a very helpful framework for considering how to engage others in debate and persuasion. Now, we've had quite a few questions in this class over the last 5 weeks about how to persuade those who are vaccine hesitant to get vaccinated. And just earlier this week, we had that in part of the Q&A. In this article, Dr. Lakeisha Anderson and Dr. Christy Ledford note that we're all being inundated with messages about prevention of the spread of the virus. And this was starting in March of last year, with the World Health Organization director stating last spring that, quote, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. And that's something that could be really debilitating and difficult for public health campaigns. Anderson and Ledford in this article framed this as a question of credibility. And they note, communication scholars and practitioners are uniquely situated to provide insight into the foundation of any successful communication campaign, credibility. Now, what I think is particularly helpful is how they discuss various types of credibility. Now, Anderson and Ledford discuss credibility as three different components or types of credibility. And that's trust, educated expertise, and experiential expertise. Now, for instance, many of us would refer to our healthcare providers as credible. And if we went to our doctors and they suggested you should get the vaccine, we would probably follow their advice. In that case, we're drawing upon their educated expertise. But it's not uncommon to also seek other medical information. So we might also seek out someone who is an infectious disease expert, perhaps. That would also equate to then experiential expertise. These other sources might also have educated expertise, but their experience in treating a particular condition boosts their credibility. There's another factor in determining credibility, and that's trust. As the authors note, trust can trump educated or experiential expertise when someone's faced with conflicting information or what an individual might see as conflicting information. The article includes the graphic on the right of the screen right now. It's a matter of finding the right mix, they say, for each person. What mix of trust, educated expertise, and experiential expertise is viewed as the most credible for that person or that segment of the audience? Now, one of the challenges that with social media, we've been conditioned to prioritize experiential expertise. Think about user reviews and crowdsourced content. We're often looking to see what others' experiences have been, and we are largely reliant upon that. Now, what communication scholars can provide, according to Anderson and Ledford, is a framework for how to identify the most credible sources for our audience. And that takes some audience analysis. Now, we can work to match each audience segment to the source that they find the most credible. For some, that might be Dr. Fauci. For others, it might be a local pastor or a social media influencer, perhaps. The success of any public health campaign is dependent upon how effectively we can communicate that campaign and develop persuasive strategies to maximize compliance. I have a colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Johnson-Young, who is expertise is in this area, health communication. And in her courses on public health campaigns, they're able to work on case studies like this to think about how do we more effectively adapt our communication to gain greater trust and support for public health campaigns. Now, in my mind, this all comes back to a need to better understand and empathize with one another. If we can learn to not only feel and understand another's perspective, then we're more likely to find some common ground. Now, as we take our next steps to further emerge from the pandemic, I hope that we're thoughtful about not only what our communities have experienced, but also what we can do to shape our new normal, not only for how we communicate, but in so many different areas of our lives. What is that new normal going to look like? I think there's a great deal of potential for how we go forward, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about how we can make the most of this opportunity. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rao. We do have quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with the top vote getter, which had to do about communication with family and friends. This question kind of started off with a statement saying that this person noticed that their communication with their family and friends was better during the pandemic. And their concern is that as we go back to normal or to the new normal, that we may go back on some of that communication, that frequent communication. And I guess maybe the question is, do you think that we've learned something about better communication, more regular communication with loved ones?
Well, I certainly hope so. This is something I've given a lot of thought to as well. And, my kids tease me a little bit about how I'm bemoaning the return to normal or even a new normal, because there were so many aspects of lockdown and the quarantine that were really beneficial because of this, and as I mentioned, reaching out, having regular Zoom calls with families strewn across the country, around the world. I don't want to miss out on that. And I've already seen that we don't hold them quite as frequently as we did before. I think this is where we need to be thoughtful about our communication practices. This is really within your power to control. And it's easy enough to be able to say, hey, we know how to use Zoom now. And even elderly members of our family know how to use it effectively. Let's make sure we get together for another Zoom call. Let's make sure that we're intentional about our communication. I do worry about the pendulum swinging back too far. And I think that'll happen a little bit, and then hopefully it'll settle somewhere in between where we can make use of these tools. And I'm excited about making use of these tools personally in class and at work. There are a lot of opportunities here. So, thanks for the question, whoever posted it. I agree. I'm concerned about losing some of what we've gained. And I think if we're intentional about it, we can make the best of what that new normal is going to look like.
So, one of the questions that's come up is something that actually you and I have already talked about. So I'm glad the question's there, because I want to hear you sort of opine on this a little bit more, and that is the future of meetings. We all have meetings at our work, our place of work. Undoubtedly, there's going to be people that want to come back and have face-to-face meetings, and they see a lot of value in that. And there's going to be people that want to continue with their Zoom meetings, right? What's the future of hybrid? I mean, what are the implications of moving forward with hybrid formats where you allow some folks to be there face to face and others to Zoom in? I mean, what's your analysis of meetings like that and the future of meetings like that?
That's a great question. You must have been listening in on the discussion that Keith and Betsy and I have had over the last couple of weeks about this. But don't we all love meetings? I say that tongue in cheek because sometimes we bemoan the fact that we have all of these meetings, but it's also great to be able to connect. And being able to do it online provided access for individuals that, because of childcare perhaps, or because of health concerns, of course, we were able to access it remotely. I have given a little bit of thought to this in terms of hybridity of meetings and be able to mix the two. And I think there's a lot of potential there. We aren't quite there with the technology. We all became fairly adept at using Zoom on our devices, our laptops, our tablets, our phones, and we became pretty good at that. One difficulty I found when we would have, family Zoom meetings, if you had a large family in one space and they had their one device, it was really difficult to hear all of them. And so I experimented with that a little bit. I started with a wireless microphone that we could pass around. I cooked up my laptop to our family room TV so that everybody sitting on the couches could see the Zoom call there. And I put the camera on a tripod. I think there's some potential there. And I think that certainly in workplace settings, they've already kind of scratched the surface on this. And if you remember a couple of years ago, there was a bit of a movement to have meeting rooms where they would have a large screen TV and they would have a conference table in front of it, with the idea that you could have a group in one site meet with a group in another site. So they've already worked on some of that hybrid model. What we need to do is make sure that we have the technology that's going to be able to support it. It's been remarkable to see the technological innovations, the advancements that occurred. I've worked with Zoom for a long time, and it seemed like there were always some changes and so were updates, but nothing like what we saw March through even April. The number of security updates that were necessary, and it was important that they updated. But adding things like how you were going to share your screen with people in breakout rooms, and how you could add backgrounds for security purposes for people that are at home to be able to blur the background. Those are developments that they can explore and they can find ways to do it. So I think that if businesses are looking into that possibility, there'll be some technology that'll come out that'll provide better microphones. That's one catch. That's difficult because you want to make sure you can hear everybody, but also better cameras that'll be able to show a larger space. The last thing I'll mention about this is that schools have been experimenting with this in the spring. There are a number of students that were still virtual. At first, everybody was virtual. I know for my kids' school, there were a number of kids that went back, and then the other students that were virtual could still log in, and they saw a camera view of the entire classroom. And so there was a hybrid model. It didn't always work. Sometimes the instructor would forget the people on the screen and only talk to the people in the classroom. That'll come with a little bit more practice, but I think there's some potential there. We just need the technology to make sure that it is effective, that we can really hear and see one another well.
So the next question has to do with generational usage of technology and digital media. So this person states that in the past, millennials and Gen Z have been judged for their over-reliance on digital media. So now that the world is using digital communication tools much more than before, do you think that this perception is going to change?
It's an excellent question. I really like this. We often joke in our family, my father, who is not only not a boomer, I think he's a silent generation. He's always on his phone. My kids are always teasing him. They say, oh, look at these kids on their phone all the time. This sense that it's Gen Z or millennials are digital natives, I think is a bit of a misnomer. And I've always pushed back against this a little bit, because just because somebody has grown up with the technology doesn't mean they know how to use it effectively. Or that they know what the best practices are for that technology. So I think that we place too much of an expectation on younger generations to know how to use it well, and that we place kind of the burden that it's all them and it's not us. We've all really engaged even before the pandemic. And you think about saturation rates for smartphones and tablets and laptops and a lot of the technology. If you look at social media platforms, most of the students that we talk to at UMW realize, and they'll note that Facebook, for instance, is definitely for their parents. That's for an older generation. And that was before the pandemic. And now we're at the point where almost everyone has made, and it's a gross generalization, but the vast majority of US adults of all ages have made great use of this technology. So I think that perception has changed a little bit. It deserves to change a little bit. I think that millennials and Gen Z get a bit of a bad rap for that. And certainly it's the case now that we're all guilty of over-reliance on digital technologies. We need to dial it back a little bit, but I think we've also just developed a bit of an appreciation for what it can provide.
Well, speaking of reliance on digital technologies, the next question that came up refers to the internet access as a public utility. Is that the next iteration here of, much like water and electricity, is it becoming a public utility?
That's a great question. This is something that was certainly discussed pre-pandemic, but the move for it, I think, has grown rapidly during the pandemic, of course, because we realized that everyone really needed access. So we talked about making sure that students had the technology. I think UNESCO estimated that 1.5 billion students went online during the pandemic. That's a tremendous number of students around the world. But then we realized this is something they have a right to access, and they need to be able to access us online. One of the interviews that I referenced in my presentation, I think it was Stephen Downes, that was a series of interviews with thought leaders in communication technologies, talking about what will happen over the next several years up through 2025. This was something they underscored, and it's really a matter of inequality and making sure that we address some of the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. We need to make sure that we don't leave sectors of society behind. And one access point for that would be internet. I think that it's important that they consider that. There's a big move for consideration of thinking about internet access as and regulating it and offering it as a utility. And certainly there's a more informed understanding, at least I hope, a more informed understanding and discussion about regulation of even online platforms to talk about what their role is in terms of providing a public good. If we get to this idea of real civil discourse and debate, it's going to be dependent upon these technologies. And so far, those technologies and platforms have really run unchecked. And we need some regulation to make sure that all have access, that it's serving the greater good, and that there's some checks in terms of privacy and dealing with inequities.
Okay, the next question, you spoke a little bit about how the digital communication, especially say Zoom meetings for students who maybe they were shy, or this question actually has to do with students with Asperger's. This is from Haley, and Haley says, I wonder if, quote unquote, normal people have started to realize, I'm sorry, it just went up. There we go. Have started to realize how poor their own interpersonal communication skills are. And Haley's had to call out ordinary people on their communication skills. So, talk a little bit about technology, different ways of communicating, of accessing technology, and how this we can all learn something from it, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Haley. That's a really great discussion point, and I think we could probably spend hours talking about this. There are a couple of points that I want to make about this. Certainly, access, in terms of access for individuals that otherwise might have some challenges in face-to-face interactions. Online technologies have provided a great access point, and we've seen this, and I referenced some of that in the presentation. I think that it's important the way we frame this. When we consider what is typical or normal interaction or communication. It's only typical or normal because that's what we've been doing. And to say that online and communication patterns or interpersonal skills in one setting is better than the other probably has as much to do with how well we've trained and supported and developed those skills than it does the actual setting. So if you think about a very formal setting or one-on-one versus small group, there's some different expectations in terms of the norms and roles that you would play. And I think that we kind of fall back on what we expect to be kind of standard expectations, standard roles in those settings. And we don't do enough to really reflect on it. I think one of the reasons why I've been always proud of UMW for having an oral communication requirement, and that we really require students to think about, reflect on how are they communicating, what allows for effective communication in a classroom. And that's different as a presentation. Everybody just falls back to public speaking. That's only one small part of all of this. Interpersonal skills, Haley, you're right, are so important. And we don't give enough time, we don't spend enough time or put enough effort into thinking about how to improve those interpersonal skills. That's different than meeting, and think about interpersonal. When we talk about first-year students, I do a lot of work on this in assessing communication apprehension. interpersonal between two friends is very different than interpersonal between a student and their advisor. There's a different power differential. There's a difference in formality, and it can really change the way you're going to interact. We need to spend more time talking about that. And I think in traditional communication settings, we should explore this more. We should spend more time developing these understandings and roles and norms. But I also think we should learn how to do that and be more explicit in that training and discussion about online tools so that we can be as adept, because otherwise we're selling ourselves short. I think there's a lot of potential there for everyone, really at any end of the spectrum. I hope that answers or gets to some of what Haley was asking about. Thanks for that question, Haley.
Well, let's return to the topic of meetings. Question from one of our colleagues, Dean Pete Kelly, who's the Dean of our College of Education, who asks about what's lost when we move to virtual meetings. You know, what are the aspects of a face-to-face meeting that are lost at virtual meetings? And maybe beyond that, what's the impact of that?
Sure. Thanks for this, Dean Kelly. I appreciate this question, and something that we've given a lot of thought to. And I know my colleagues in the department have discussed this quite a bit. I think it depends on what you mean by transition. You know, when we move from one to the other. As I was just saying, kind of in response to Haley's question, part of this has to do with what we are most comfortable with, what we most have a facility with in terms of communication practices. So in the pandemic, when you had groups that were used to meeting face-to-face and then they met online for the first time, that wasn't going to go very well. There were going to be problems. And you'll probably notice that there's some real differences between how we interacted in group meetings online a year ago versus now. We've all become much better at managing that and being more effective in the way that we communicate. I think there's also something to be said for the way that when we consider what is lost, yes, that is a little more challenging to be able to pick up on nonverbal cues, perhaps, and some verbal cues too, because we haven't adapted to the way we're communicating there. But think about the way you would have a conversation with someone in the room versus having it on the phone. We all adapt to that. We know that sometimes you have to speak a little bit louder, or when you're listening, you've got to make sure you have a good, clear connection. We're adapting because of the medium that's being used. Same thing has to happen for virtual meetings. And I think that as we develop those skills, as we develop better technology to reflect how we can communicate, to get across better nonverbal cues, you know, with higher resolution, you know, those nonverbal cues are a little clearer. It's easier to pick up on that, to know how to pin a certain picture so that you have it on a second screen, perhaps, makes it a little easier to pick up on some of that. I think what we would largely see as lost can be made up. I don't think that it's inherently different or inherently worse. It's just a matter of being able to adapt to that. I think the other aspect of this is that when we're thinking about adapting to this, we should also consider what are some of the benefits. You know, I've had some discussions with colleagues in faculty governance about what should we do for the University Faculty Council meetings next year. You know, in the past, when I was on faculty council, we would hold the meetings, we would record them, and people could access them later, watch the recording. Then we started streaming some of them, but people that were watching online, it was a little difficult too, it was a little clunky. But over this last year, when we started using Zoom meetings, not only did we find that we all developed a facility for handling it, and we had better discussions over time, and we learned how to use online discussion boards at the same time as Q&A and the chatbot box, but we also found that more people were able to be part of those discussions than ever before. We rarely had as big an audience when we had it face-to-face, but a faculty council meeting that was held online sometimes would have 30, 40. I remember chairing one of them that had 120 people that logged in for that faculty council meeting. That never happened when it was face-to-face. So when we think about virtual meetings, there are ways that we need to adapt, and if we're not careful about adapting, there will be certain elements of communication that will be lost. But when we think about what the potential benefits might be, we should really be clear-eyed about how we should go forward with access to this technology, use access to the platforms to be able to get a broader audience and to be able to get other voices involved than we ever had before.
So continuing on the subject of work, Amethyst has a question, and Amethyst has gone back to work, shifting back to working in an office, and has noticed that coworkers and Amethyst herself are less productive when we work from home than when we work from home. So being in the office is less productive than working from home. And what do you think about that? Why might that be? And do you think that more people will argue for more virtual work days in the future?
It's a great question, Amethyst, and I think that you're right in your observation in many ways. There's a lot being written right now about this as companies are coming out with their timetables for returning to the office, expecting everybody back August 1 or sometime in the fall. And a number of employees are pushing back. And you see this in big corporations where the employees are saying, wait a minute, we're just as productive, if not more productive when we work from home. And some of the research really bears that out. There have been some studies that found that workers were as productive or more productive when working from home, specifically during the pandemic, than they were when they were in their workplace. I think another factor to consider is that as we're returning to work, there's a transition that's occurring. In the same way that when we had to transition to being at home during lockdown, there were some, we hit some roadblocks and there were some speed bumps there that we had to negotiate. When we go back to work, we're not going to be as efficient because we're getting used to being back in an office environment, being back perhaps on campus or in your office and working and interacting with each other. There's another aspect of this that I found fascinating, didn't really have a chance to get into, but the psychological impact of returning to large group settings when we've been so used to being isolated is a very difficult transition. As much as we don't like to be isolated, I was in a meeting with some colleagues earlier today, and one colleague said that she's just not ready to expand her group, the size of social groups as much as she had before. She's used to smaller settings now. And I have to say that when I go to a store now, I'm fully vaccinated and I'm still wearing a mask. If I see a lot of people in the store, I find it unnerving. I think that'll also happen at work. If we're not careful about this, if you just try to flip the switch and say, everybody back, it's going to be incredibly distracting, and it's going to be hard to imagine being as productive. But back to the original point about productivity, I think there are a lot of surveys and studies that show that we can be as productive working from home. There's a little caveat to that, and I have as a point of concern. I certainly think that we should have more options for work from home, for remote work. There's some great opportunities there. I was also concerned that during the pandemic, it seemed like we lost track of a timetable or a timeline. It wasn't work from 9 to 5. Many of us were working around the clock because you always have your device there. You're never really bridging, going and having the distinction between being at work and being at home. Everything is blurred between the two. And so I have a little concern about the expectation that if you're working from home, you're accessible all the time, or that you're trying to work outside normal hours. But even with that said, I think that we can be just as productive. And that's an important point that we need to be able to make with our employers.
So what do you think is the net result of the pandemic? Do you think people have become better communicators because of this? Or do you think it's actually hurt communication skills?
Sure. Well, I think that's something that we're going to have to parse out in the next few months or the next year or so. But the reason I have a little bit of concern in answering that is that I think that there's still some repercussions, some lingering effects of people being so isolated, and in particular, some of the polarization that we saw. And that has probably less to do with communication practices and more to do with some of the political, social turmoil that we're experiencing. I think all of that seeps in and it changes. That might impact whether or not we can say we really were as effectively communicating as we would like to. Now, my gut reaction to this is that I think on balance, we're probably more effective communicators because we were able to make use of some of these tools. We were still working interpersonally face-to-face in many instances, and especially now that there's more people are getting vaccinated and they're getting ready to re-enter and work with people. They're still maintaining some of the digital connections that they had, which allowed for more vibrant, widespread discussions and communication than they ever had before. I think if we can retain that and we can find a way to develop a good balance between face-to-face interactions along with digital tools and technologies, that we will be more effective communicators. And one of the best tests of that, I think, will be the sense of diversity of perspectives. When I teach small group communication, one of the most important lessons that I want to be able to share with the students is that you're not as productive working on your own as you are in a group. The group work will take longer. It will take more work. It'll be more challenging than doing it on your own. But because you're working with a diversity of voices and perspectives and opinions, you will end up with a better product in the end. And so this sense of broader access, of having bigger audiences, more people that you can communicate with from different geographic areas with diversity of opinions and backgrounds and ideas, means that we will be better informed. We will be able to develop better ideas and engage in the kind of civil discourse and debate that we really need. I think we're primed for that. It's a matter of making sure that we can break out of some of that polarization and stay as engaged as we were.
So talking about polarization, maybe one of the reasons that we kind of tend to stay with our like kind is just trust on the internet, being safe, and not knowing what other people's intent might be in the virtual world. So how do you think that we should approach this in the future?
Yeah, that's a concern for me. I'm pretty active online in a lot of ways in a couple of different platforms, but I'm very wary as well, and sometimes very careful about what kinds of discussions or debates that I want to get involved in. That said, I also want to make sure that I'm trying to expose myself to as many different perspectives as possible. During the pandemic, as Tim Levine pointed out, and I referenced a couple of times in the talk, because we were socially isolated and physically isolated, that really compounded the isolation that we feel online, because we weren't getting the connection interpersonally that we would normally have. And then when we were online and we were suspicious, it just compounded the problem. I think it will get a little bit better as we have more social interaction, but there's still an ongoing concern about this. I can only say what I've kind of talked to some students about and what I try to do. How do we manage that? The first is to try to assume the better of whoever it is that you're interacting with online. And I found that there have been a couple of times when you make a comment online and somebody else responds to it and they tend to take it to 10 or 11 immediately. I'll back channel them. And I try to do a little bit more to back channel and say, I just want to understand what's going on. Did I misinterpret what you're saying? Did you misinterpret what I was saying? And to clarify that. Rarely will you find the person is ready to say, yes, I'm ready to take you on in this. And I should be suspicious of their motives. Most of the time they'll say, well, wait a minute, I misunderstood. There's something here that was missing in what was being communicated. It de-escalates it. So dealing with that suspicion, I think the first would be to assume that most of the time, it's just like people that you know in your neighborhood. Most of the people that you're interacting with have good intent. They don't mean you harm. And that's true also online. The problem with it is that because of that disinhibition, we're more likely to post something that's a little more out there than we probably would if we were there face to face with somebody. So when we see that happen, I would suggest you try to engage with them, try to back channel them and talk about it. You can always disengage, and you don't really want to escalate it or take it much further, but find other ways to try and engage and have discussions with people, because I think it's really beneficial to hear those perspectives. Let them know that you don't come in with the intent to malign them or any malicious intent. You're just really trying to engage one another. And most of the time, I think that's successful. Still keep your guard up a little, be suspicious when, something really out of the ordinary is going on. But I think that if you reach out and try to engage back channeling and try to find out what the real intent is, most of the time you'll find that people have your interest at heart and they're not out to get you.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much for being a part of this course. It was a terrific presentation and a really good discussion here to end the 5-week course. Thank you all for joining us. This has really been a great experience. Students, don't forget, you have a paper to write. Papers are due at the end of next week. Information about the papers is posted in Canvas. And for all of you who are alumni, community members, faculty, staff, friends of the university, thank you so much for joining us for the course. We really have a great time doing this, and it's a great way to engage with the community in a much broader way. So on behalf of Dr. Anand Rao, Professor of Communication and Chair of our Department of Communication and Digital Studies, Dr. Betsy Lewis, Professor of Spanish and the Assistant Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences, and myself, and I'm a Professor of Mathematics occasionally, and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Stay in touch, and happy 4th of July weekend.